I took a couple of months long hiatus, and we're back with another video. And joining me today is my uncle Trey. What's up?
What's going on, everybody? Good to be back. How you doing, Mikey?
Great, man. Glad to be back on this channel. It's been so long doing videos. I miss it. I've been busy. Yeah, I'm back, and we about to upload some more great videos. Like today, we have a interesting topic today. We're going to talk about Uncle Tom and where did that term come from, who was the real Uncle Tom, and one thing that we're going to prove today, it's we're kind of going to redeem that term because ever since I was a kid and as long as I can remember, that term Uncle Tom was more so a negative, but today we're gonna tell you guys that this term is actually positive, and it comes from the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, and also the guy that is based off Josiah Henson, and we're gonna talk about this man's life and the impact that he made. So yeah, he was born in June 15, 1789, and died May 5th, 1883. So he was born into slavery, and he escaped and moved to Upper Canada in the 1830s. So what you got to say about him, Trey?
Well, the first thing is that term, Uncle Tom, within the black community is something that was used, as you said, even with you being younger than me, it's a term that I've heard my whole life. I know my father grew up listening and hearing as well, which just kind of meant that you were a black person who you were not invested into the future of black society. You was a person who basically you had self-hatred. You didn't want to be black. You loathed or you despised being black, and you would work with people who were not in the black community to hinder black society from moving ahead. So this is a very deep and a very heavy term. To be called an Uncle Tom, that's highly offensive. So when you look at that term, that's heavy. So to do what we're doing today and break down the origins, and then to kind of find it's an oxymoronic situation, uh, it may be kind of eye opening to some people. But as you said, we start by looking at Josiah Henson. And Josiah Henson was an enslaved African from the. He was born in the late 1700s, and he lived in Maryland before having to go to Kentucky and do some work for a slave owner, and then eventually getting to Canada. The key is he became his memoir, which was written in 1849, became the basis for the character Uncle Tom in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel. So when we look at that, we have to do two things. You know, like I know, Mikey, and you're definitely into movies, and you break down movies much more intently than I do, or intensely, or I would say just deeper. When we look at Josiah Henson and his influence on that book, how much of that was fiction, which we know is a novel from Harriet Beecher Stowe, and let's also look at the perspective. She was a white abolitionist, and we're talking about a black former slave who settled in Canada. So we have to keep that in mind first. And then, secondly, we have to be able to say, how did this come about if the information we're ready to give is converse or adverse to what the term means in general society for black people? We got to take a look at that. So it's kind of two parts. What did she write about, and how did she come about or get to this level? And then also, why would black people embrace this term, even though the information was out there in his own book from 1849?
Oh, I think I think media has a lot to do with it. So when we think of Uncle Tom, we think of Uncle Ruckus from the Boondocks, and he makes me
Yeah.
laugh. Samuel L. Jackson, Steven.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it makes me laugh thinking about these two characters, but in reality, those guys are just horrible people. But so I think it started because I was doing my research. I have saw like quick summary of clips and movies and short films of like what the book is based off, what the show is based off of, or movie Tom's Cabot, and they depicted this guy as a uneducated, someone that just like a uneducated older slave,
Mm-hmm.
um, trans a white little girl, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
and he was he didn't really hang around the other blacks. He preferred to be around whites, and he isolated himself from blacks. And what makes the portrayal of him different in the book, um, died. Well, he was killed, beaten to death because he refused to snitch on the slaves that ran away.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see the difference here, and he was definitely the real Uncle Tom was definitely not what we think Uncle Tom is today. And also also about Josiah Henson, then you say he used to take cotton from his own bag and put it into the six or the weaker slaves to make it seem like they've been working. Right.
Yeah, he was a very caring individual. Josiah Henson was very, very compassionate towards the enslaved Africans that lived in the area that he lived in. You know, he saw and was probably traumatized by the fact that his mother, his dad, his father tried to stand up for his mother, and he received 100 lashes, and they cut his ear off, and then they sold him away from the family. He then had to become a trafficker for the slave owner in Maryland. He was going back and forth doing business in Kentucky. So he easily could have had a chance just to, oh my God, this is horrible. I really don't want to have to do or really deal with being black. But that wasn't the case. It's in the memoirs that he was helping out enslaved Africans who were weaker, who didn't have the same stamina or strength that he had. Also, it's documented that he helped over 200 slaves escape. He escaped his own self when he found out they wanted to separate him and his wife. So those don't seem like characteristics, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Mikey. I don't give those type of characteristics to a weak person. I wouldn't give those type of characteristics to a person who hates themselves. Because if that was the case, once he got free, okay, why are you going back to help any other Africans? What's the purpose? You're free. You don't like them anyway. You can't stand being black. Why would you risk your life? So I'm seeing some differences here in a portrayal of the book. And we know that it's based on this character, but think about, as you said, the media. This book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, made $1 million within the first year, which is equivalent to $35 million today. That's a lot of money. The only book that outsold it was the Bible. This was a major, major, major smash success, we can say, from a white abolitionist who writes a book based on the memoirs of a black enslaved person who really was not, how do I put this, as weak as the portrayal comes. Even though, as you said, he ended up dying because he would not tell on some people. Uh, Somehow, some way, the connotation of Uncle Tom, I'll put it this way, and we did this on your channel. We sat there and we looked at Django. We looked at Django. And when we looked at Django, we automatically came away with a perception that Stephen was what? A person that hated himself, that did not want to see other blacks in positions that were advantageous, and would do anything to prevent that from happening. Am I correct? Is that not the first perception we got of Stephen.
Yeah, that's the first perception. That's what you thought of him at first, but as the movie go off, he was more complex than that. He had his own motives.
Oh yeah, we know the initial perception doesn't mean that was the actual reality. We don't have the entire story of why Stephen was that way, but I mean a lot of it, as you said, the complexity, and we can see even he wanted to save his own self towards the end, before the character Django told him to stop, and had a little, I guess we could call it a mini soliloquy for him real quick before whatever happened.
The fact that the fact that he tricked the white people to thinking that he needed a cane to walk, and he dropped the cane and
Yeah, stood straight up. But he realized what he did ensured him the power that he wanted.
Yeah.
We have to look at it from a different perspective of who really wants to be out in the burning sun, working for hours, picking cotton, or doing all of the manual labor that was very harsh on those enslaved people. No one really wanted to do that. So he saw a ticket, and he was able to manipulate his way into the house, and even trick and manipulate his way up the totem pole to where Calvin Candy was sitting and talking with him as if he was a colleague. We have to be honest. So perceptions don't automatically mean that that's the reality. And it must mean that we have to take that into account with this. By all accounts, Josiah Henson was nowhere near a weak individual. But perception, that's probably also for what happened early on with them, might have had an influence on Harriet Beecher Stowe, to where when she made and created this character, he came off as weak and impersonated himself. That might be where the connotation became to, oh man, you were Uncle Tom, you were Uncle Tom, as opposed to realizing that, no, it's not a weak person. There's more to this person than you thinking that he just hates himself.
So, what do you think? Um, Trying to figure out how I'm going to come up with this. So, the legacy of this guy, because I don't. A lot of people. This is a good. This is the reason why this is a good video to do, because it's educating people. Because everybody used the word Uncle Tom at least once in their life or heard of it, but a lot of people probably don't even know where the term comes from. So, what do you think the legacy of this of Josiah Henson should be going forward?
I was fortunate enough with your great aunt, maybe your great great aunt, who owns the property over in Canada. I was able to take the family over there to see actually Josiah Henson museum dedicated to his life, because he did great work for those enslaved people who did leave the United States and moved into Canada. A little bit of history with that was a lot began to leave after 1850, because you had the Fugitive Slave Act. So let me tell you what that was. 1850 comes along, and the way the United States was set up, we live in the state of Michigan. When Michigan came in 1838, Arkansas came in. And this all started really 30 years earlier. Missouri compromised. Missouri wanted to come in as a slave state, and it would have changed the balance of power in the in Congress. Okay, now you would have had one more slave state and free state, and they wasn't about to allow that. So from 1820 all the way to 1860, any state that came in free, a slave state came in as well, and vice versa. So now California wants to become a state, all right? Guess what you don't have? Any slave state to come in. Guess what the slave states say? If California want to be a state, y'all got to give us something. Guess what the I think at that time the Republicans, who definitely had more the interest of the black people, they said, well, I guess we'll have to work with you guys. And they were like, we want our slaves back who have escaped to the north. All right. So they signed into law, Mikey, the Fugitive Slave Act, which says that a white bounty hunter can go up to New York City, can go to Philadelphia, can go to Boston, okay? Can go to these places, and if they see, quote unquote, a slave of theirs, they have the right to pick them up and take them back home. Now, are we talking about an era where you had a driver's license and other pieces of information to identify yourself? Are we talking about that time frame? No, we're not. So now all the blacks that live in Philadelphia, most of them that live in Boston, most of them that live in New York, guess what they got to do? They leave. Guess where they end up going? Canada. Okay? So we were able to go over there, see how he did great things with those people. Now you understand the condition. That's how you ended up with a lot of blacks in Ontario, one of the most populous province in Canada. So here's the point. He went over there. He did great. This man really left a legacy. I'm just going to be honest. They're not going to create a museum for a person who was weak, who hated blacks, who did not help the community in the United States and even in Canada, if that wasn't the type of person he was. He was an abolitionist, he was a minister, and he was a person that was deeply entrenched in the Underground Railroad, characteristics of a person who was of value and stature in the black community of that time. So we have a very misconstrued and jaded view of who Josiah Henson really was. The knowledge is there for us to get, but we have to connect it, Mikey, to the fact that when we say Uncle Tom, and Malcolm X used it, and there was other blacks, prominent blacks that used the term, when we're saying Uncle Tom, we're actually being disrespectful to Josiah Henson. We can't use the terminology Uncle Tom from Harriet Beecher Stowe's book and detach it from Josiah Henson because that was the motivation. It's not an accurate depiction, but we have to be very sensitive to how it's connected to him, his life and his legacy, and we really disrespecting one of the ancestors.
This guy has a lot of his legacy. He also the first black man to be featured on.
Say that again.
He's the first black man to be featured on a Canadian stamp as well. So
yes, because they realized how valuable he was to black civilization, especially because you had an influx of blacks coming into Canada at that time. So he showed his stature. He showed his value on both sides. I'm talking about in the United States and outside the United States. And I just think that's one thing that myself and some colleagues of mine, especially when I was in college, we did was to really speak on the fact, if I call you Uncle Tom, that's a term of endearment. It's not a negative connotation. And we were able to really have that dialogue with some professors and some other people that we knew to kind of get that myth dispelled, if you understand what I'm saying, Mikey.
So, anything else that you like to say about his legacy or anything about him?
I just think that really we have to keep pushing this narrative. And I will say the term Uncle Tom has been replaced with Stephen. The newer generation don't use Uncle Tom like that. Stephen is more the perception of a black person who's a sellout, who's a old school Uncle Tom. You hate yourself, you hate your people, you're weak, you're feeble. You just mean no good for the progress of black people. So Stephen is becoming more of a replacement, and it's based on a fictional character once again. And Tarantino hasn't really gave us the motivation for Stephen like that. We know where Django comes from, which was the spaghetti westerns of the 1960s. He just added his own spin to it. But I would just say, if those conversations come up, us just making sure that we put the Uncle Tom narrative in the right category. He was a hero, not a punk.
So doing this research and learning about this, about it was profound. I didn't even know half of the stuff. I was always curious. Um, where does the term Uncle Tom come from? I know I heard of the book, but I am currently reading it actually because I actually read a little bit of it before we started recording. So yeah, I'm still learning about this guy. Um,
And let's not forget, you're learning about a perception of this guy from a white female abolitionist of the 1850s. So
Definitely,
we
but
have,
he also have a documentary. It's
yes,
called Redemption of Josiah Henson,
yeah.
and I
And
think great word to use about his legacy redemption because his for years is it like the term Uncle Tom is negative, but now I guess his name should be redeemed because it's a hero, not a off guy.
that's a great way of putting it. I love the fact you said redeemed. His name should be redeemed. His legacy should be redeemed. And something else that I'm looking at when it comes to this is someone else's perspective of something is just that. We can respect what she had. I don't have to agree with it. But we're in the information age, and I just challenge everyone to do the research and understand the totality of certain situations. As you said, we need to redeem his name because we automatically looked at a female abolitionist of the 1850s perspective of the memoirs of a gentleman telling us about the things he had to go through. So I would say this: if the slave narratives of Frederick Douglass was written by maybe uh, Lewis Tappan, who was a prominent abolitionist,
Uh,
uh, and I'm thinking about there was another two brothers that lived in New York that they wrote this. They had a paper called, I believe, The Liberator. Slipping my mind right now, but anyway, uh, it may have been different. And then also, I would say this: look at the time frame it was in. Could she have really wrote a book, Mikey, where you have just turned a runaway slave into a hero? How would you actually really do that and sell so many copies without putting your own self at risk, if you understand what I'm saying? So,
um, her book was also one thing that we forgot to bring about. Um, Abraham Lincoln actually invited her to the White House
mhm.
and accused her. I don't know if it was accused, but I don't know if he accused her or was he joking. But he said, "Oh, so you are the one to start the Civil War."
Well,
He said that to her.
it's been said before that that took place.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is it's almost the same perspective as Mikey. Um, I'm trying to think of the correlation. It just slipped my mind because they say that Rosa Parks not getting up out of that seat began the civil rights movement. That act of not getting up out of her seat led to the signing eventually of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which was 10 years later. So it's been said that if you really study history, I talked about that Fugitive Slave Act that started in 1850. That was really the first straw, or I ain't gonna say the last straw. I really should say kind of the first scenario or the first punch being thrown. Then you had Uncle Tom's Cabin bringing light to what's going on. Then you'll learn about later on in the 1850s, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Border Ruffians, where you had individuals trying to bring enslaved people from one state across another line, and they fighting and killing each other. And then you'll learn about Millard Fillmore and James Pierce, two what they call weak presidents that just let things really get out of hand. And then you get to Lincoln and Douglas, and Lincoln gets elected, and boom, South Carolina secedes. So that's not the only thing, but people will say that. But it's just like in the Civil Rights Act or the Civil Rights era. A lot of people say Sister Rosa Parks was the one that got it started. Also,
I
Mikey,
thought
some people may say Emmett Till's murder could
what
have
I was
also
going to say.
been something to get it started. Because that happened in 55 as well, because he was 14 years old. So, and I'm pretty sure it happened before Sister Rosa had that issue, because the bus boycott of Montgomery, Alabama started in December 1955. So you see how we can see things from our own lens, but we do know that Harriet Beecher Stowe's book was a major influence on America's perception and the divide that created the Civil War. We cannot doubt that. Not with $35 million generated through sales, and only the Bible sold more copies than that. And we're talking about a 19th century, Christian-based society of America at that time. So, yeah, it definitely had a major effect on the Civil War. I'm not going to say it was the cause that started it.
Anything, final thoughts about Josiah Henson, his life, or anything, or would that be it?
I got immense respect for him. Anybody in this metro area, hopefully after things kind of, metro area, Detroit is what I'm referring to. Hopefully after things kind of get back to normal and travel, international travel to Canada from Michigan, it becomes more of a feasible thing to do. I definitely suggest getting over there. I think it's Dresden, Canada, and just seeing his museum and seeing where he stayed. He's definitely a man of valor. He's definitely a man of high character, and I'm just kind of happy that we're moving away from using that term Uncle Tom as a negative connotation. And I just think we should really do as much research as possible and pay homage to him. And if I say Uncle Tom, people should know that I'm talking about someone in a respectful way. That's all I have to say.
Definitely. I'm gonna say I agree with everything that you said. So this is Black History Month. We're going to be doing a bunch of different topics on Black History Month and just different videos on sometimes historical events or just spotlight on some individuals that you may or may not. So, because everybody knows about the Martin Luther King X first, even I think we might touch on those individuals as well, but we also highlight some I've never heard. Some people that hasn't had a lot of publicity, or you know what I'm trying to say. Not a lot has been said. Like these are the people that people to have a tendency, like history, have a tendency to forget a lot of things.
Yes, it does. Uh, if you were not a part of a certain era, and one thing I remember, he died last year. He was a very, very, very renowned African American historian. He focused on African history. Renuko Receipt, I think it's Receipt. That was his name. And he said, if you can't put yourself in the time frame, in the context of when something happened, you're really missing history. And we have to be able to do that. That's why I stressed just a few moments ago that I have to look at Harriet Beecher Stowe's motives as she was a white woman writing a book in the 1850s on a slave. I have to be able to put that in context and not just say, oh man, I think she did a disservice to him. I won't say that. I have to look at the context of how things happen. So it's important for us to be able to do that contextually, put yourself in a certain era. And the reason I say that is because so many times history has been lost because people only were able to relate to a certain era that they lived in. And when you do that, you sometimes miss the historical value of things that happened prior to you, but that still may affect you to this day. So, not that we're rewriting history, it's that people are going to have to be more open minded, if you understand what I'm saying. You have to be open minded. and you have to be able to place yourself in context of when something happened.
Definitely, people do that when it comes to movies or sports. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, like there's so many examples. Like you have to take into consideration that those were different times.
Yep.
Like, like for example, in basketball, points were different because back in the day they didn't have a 3-point line.
Nope.
And now, yeah, so you can't. Well, they score more this year because the players are better. That's not necessarily. Well, it could be true, but that's not 100% true because one, um, defense was a lot was was harder back in the day, and also they didn't have a 3-point line. You have to take into consideration of how it was.
And also, you make a good point. Also, think about the fact that they play more games now. So, play 82 games now. When the Boston Celtics was winning all their titles, there was only 8 teams in the league. Now you got 32.
Yep.
Now, 82 games, they didn't play nowhere near 82 games. Now you have 15 people on the roster that didn't have that. So we're comparing apples and oranges. You make a very good point. That's why I can't make the assumption that Anthony Davis is better than Wilt Chamberlain because Anthony Davis plays now and Wilt Chamberlain played back then. Can't make that assumption. They had a different point in time that they lived in that we have to realize the context of what they did. We have to. You have to. You can't say a general's better today because of the technology when Alexander the Great, or let's look at Shaka Zulu, let's look at Hannibal, let's look at some of the great generals, Genghis Khan. They were great for the time that they lived in. They utilized the resources they had, if you see what I'm saying. So we have to be able to look at that. We have to be able to look at that.
Definitely. Well, that'll do it for this video, guys. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And let's try not to, well, don't use the word Uncle Tom in a negative way. It's positive.
Yeah.
It's a positive.
Say that
So,
as a term of endearment.
yep. So if you don't get anything, just get if anything out this video, just try to get this that Josiah Henson was a good man, was a strong man, and he was very brave, and so is the term Uncle Tom. And I'll do it for this video. Thanks, guys. Peace.
All right, everybody. See you later.